With alarms sounding about a housing affordability crisis and rental vacancy rates in parts of Ontario at near historic lows, that perennial debate over rent control is back. A private member's bill currently before the Ontario legislature seeks to extend the current rent control regime to every unit in the province. Not surprisingly, opinions about that vary greatly. Let's hear some of them now with Kelly Bentley. She is Federation of Metro Tenants Associations representative. Marva Burnett, president of ACORN Canada. That's a tenants' rights group as well. Jim Murphy, president, CEO, Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario. And Stephen Scanlon, landlord of an 8-unit building in downtown Toronto. And we are happy to rekindle this debate here on TVO tonight, a debate that's been going on actually for about 70 years in the province of Ontario. And just to bring sort of you and our viewers up to scratch on all of the background, we've got this sort of handy-dandy minute-long background piece that we'll play now, and then we'll come back and chat, okay? Mr. Director, roll it, please. The debate around rent control isn't exactly new. Rent control was first introduced under the National Housing Act way back in 1944. But it didn't stick around long. It popped up again in 1975 when it became a major provincial election issue. Here it is, being debated on TVO's The Education of Mike McManus. And yes, there was live piano accompaniment back then.
Rent control, although politically attractive in a very short-term point of view, leads to a lot of very disastrous results for a lot of people.
The beginnings of what we now know as rent control became official in 1979 under the provincial government of, you guessed it, Bill Davis. Then in 1992, faced with a shortage of rentals, Bob Rae's government introduced a 5-year exemption on rent controls. Fast forward to 1996, and rent control was once again in the headlines.
And they say that if we get rid of rent controls, we'll be back in the position where they won't be building condos. In fact, they'll be building...
The Mike Harris government then introduced Bill 96. Under that bill, any rental units constructed after 1991 were exempt from rent control, but anything built prior to that was still capped by the provincial law. The hope was that developers would be encouraged to build more units. The question is, has it worked? Okay, that's some of the background on our discussion to be. And Jim, I want to start with you. How well is the current system working for you?
One of the things about the 1991 exemption specifically, Steve, was to provide certainty for investors. One of the things that we need in Ontario is investment, and the real estate sector and apartments is part of that. So it's important that that continue. When rules change, and in this area they've changed over a number of years, that's not good for investors to build product and provide housing needs for Ontarians, for Torontonians, whether they be ownership or whether it be tenant related. We have seen in the last couple of years a significant increase in the commitment from builders of new purpose-built rental.
Purpose-built rental meaning?
Purpose-built rental meaning professionally managed. So if you walk around any major city in Ontario or you drive around, you see a building that you think is an apartment building, it is professionally managed by a third party. And those buildings, we saw in Toronto last year a 50% increase in commitment to construction. And we see through Urbanation, which is a consulting firm here in Toronto, a commitment across the GTA to 28,000 new units. This is an all-time high and a record.
Let me ask the follow-up question then. If all apartment units are put under rent control, in other words, not just those before 1991, but everything, what do you think would happen?
Well, one of the things that would happen is you get into what housing economists would call the secondary market. So you get into a lot of condominiums that aren't necessarily purpose-built rental. And the City of Toronto estimates there's nearly 100,000 in the City of Toronto alone. And so it's a very different dynamic because you have much smaller owners or investors that may have 1 or 2 units as opposed to a large purpose-built building.
Okay, Marvin, let's go to you. How well do you think the current system is working for tenants?
I don't think the current system is working well enough for tenants today because right now we're pricing a lot of tenants and hard-working Ontarians out of the market. If we don't have rent control, what's going to happen? Like a couple of days ago, what happened? Somebody got noticed that their rent is going up from $1,600 to $3,200. Is this what we want for all Ontarians? We at ACORN is saying we should have rent control, and we should end vacancy decontrolled. We should end above the guideline rent increase, and we should include every building, including those built after 1991, in the rent control.
A little follow-up there. Vacancy, what did you say? Vacancy decontrol? What does that mean?
So vacancy decontrol means that when a unit becomes empty, when any unit becomes empty, a landlord can increase the rent by whatever they want. There's no barrier to how high they could put it.
Kind of starts the clock again, if you
exactly.
like.
So even if you are in a rent-controlled unit that predates the 1991 exemption, when that unit becomes vacant, you could increase it by whatever the market allows or whatever you want to. So it could be $500, it could be $1,000.
How much of that is actually happening?
I mean, it does happen. Every time a unit becomes vacant, it increases. Generally, in the condo market, it increases a lot more either way, but they are increasing. And certainly, I do want to add that the average tenant only lives in a unit for around 5 years. I mean, there are some long-term tenants that stick around for 30 years or more, particularly seniors, but generally there is turnover in these units. So there's always an opportunity for market adjustments, even in rent-controlled units.
So you're saying that even in the average situation, if it's turning over every 5 years, that's an opportunity every 5 years for the landlord to go beyond what rent controls would allow for an increase.
Exactly.
Exactly. Okay. Stephen, how well is, in your view, the current system working for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's working fine for me, but I don't think the system is working very well at all. I think you have a severe supply issue, but I don't think applying rent controls across the board is really the answer. I really worry about it, stunting investment interest and stunting supply. So the unintended consequence is that you actually restrict supply and you create housing problems. So I think some measure of rent controls does make sense because what's going on right now is the Wild West, but I don't think it needs to be as extreme as what I face with my older building.
Can I just focus on that for a little bit here?
Sure.
You've got an 8-unit building?
Yes.
Whereabouts in town?
So it's in Cabbagetown.
In Cabbagetown, okay, which is a kind of a gentrifying part of the old city of Toronto.
Yes, wonderful location.
Yes, actually a very, very desirable place for a lot of people to live.
Yes.
We heard about this, what did you call it again? Vacancy?
Rent vacancy decontrol.
Vacancy decontrol. How often does that happen in your experience in your building?
It's happening less and less because the people that used to come into my building and would buy a house after 3-4 years, it's no longer affordable. So my turnover is minimal. But when someone does leave, I do have the opportunity to raise it as high as I want. But I would rather be a bit more reasonable with my rents and have greater selection about who I allow in the building.
Is your building a pre or post 91 building?
Oh, it's pre-1991.
Pre-91. So
Pre-1900.
So you are caught under like full-blown rent control for your building.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And therefore you can only put the rent up annually by how much?
By the ministry puts out the amount every year, but it's generally equal to CPI. So
roughly the rate of inflation.
1.5% this year.
It was 1.5% this year.
It was 1.5%.
Yeah.
Could you speak to the issue that Marva brought up, which is, funnily enough, this week we have seen this, rather significant example of somebody whose rent went from $1,600 to over $3,000 in one fell swoop. I mean, would you acknowledge that's a pretty tough pill to swallow?
I don't think anybody can support a doubling of somebody's rent. What we need to have is a discussion to find a solution. We don't need to go back to the same old, because that's going to hurt tenants the most, because it's going to mean less supply and less choice. In the last couple of weeks, Steve, I've actually gone through 2 new rental buildings, one of them not very far from here at all, just north of Yonge and Eglinton here in Midtown Toronto. And it's a 90-unit new building, of which 30 people moved from an adjacent building that the builder built. And so those are 30 units that have been freed up in a much larger building that are more affordable. And so if we go back to put rent controls in and stronger rules, that is going to discourage all of the new supply that's in the pipeline that we need. I think that the province wants. Municipalities, the province want rent construction, and this is the wrong time to revisit that and go back to the old solutions. We need to find something else. We've actually been in consultation with the province. We haven't heard back from them, but we want to provide some solutions so that we just don't go back to the same old that's going to result in less units and less supply for tenants.
Let's follow up on that. Marva, do you acknowledge the premise of his argument, which is if you put controls on everything, builders will stop building new rental units?
I don't, because they've had it like this for how many years now? Since in 1972, this with the rent control on buildings, Barbary did what he had to.
Came in the middle 70s.
Right.
Rent controls initially came in the middle 70s.
So how many apartment buildings have been built since then? How many units have we made since then? We keep saying that rent control won't produce any, but how many have you guys produced for this time since, all buildings built after 1991 has been exempted?
So when rent controls came in the mid-70s after the 75 election, we saw an absolute stop in the construction of new purpose-built rental. The tax rules that favored multi-purpose building was in 1971. We still had a lot of new rental units between 71 and 76 when rent control came in. Then the NDP government, in its rent control legislation in 1991, brought in rent control legislation and brought in an exemption for new rental. The Conservative government in 1997, in their iteration of rent control, made it permanent. And so what investors and builders require is certainty. Any investor requires certainty in the market. And so we are now seeing that, and we've seen a huge commitment. Some of these projects take 3 or 4 years to happen. We've seen a huge commitment in the pipeline to that, and that provides more supply to tenants. And I fear that this will be put at risk if we just go back to the old. So what we said to the province is let's have a conversation about finding out some other solutions that might work.
I'm going to get to the solutions in a second. But Kelly, I mean, I do need to follow up on that. Even the New Democratic Party government of the early 1990s apparently realized that if you put controls on everything and don't allow exemptions for new construction, you're going to stop construction entirely. If they thought that was the case, why don't you think that's the case?
Well, we've had 26 years of the current legislation. We've had 26 years to look at how purpose-built rental units are being built in this city. And it's not panning out insofar as there's not enough purpose-built, even condo-built rental units to deal with the current lack of affordable housing or any housing in this city. So, for example, I was reading a statistic from CMHC, the Canadian Housing and Mortgage Company, and they said between 2015 and 2016, 1,511 units were completed in the GTA. When you take into account the loss of rental units due to the demolition and conversion of rental units, there was actually only a net gain of 544 units that year. There's a vacancy
almost
rate.
1,000 came off the market.
Yes, because every time a new condo is built, and it's built where tenants live, you lose some of those units because the only ones that get replaced are the ones that hit the mid-range low-income threshold set out by the City of Planning Act. So you actually lose purpose-built rental units over the course. And then you end up with a situation where we're depending on the secondary market to build housing. Well, the secondary market creates uncertainty for tenants. And as we just spoke about, I mean, recently, tenants were getting 100% rent increases. And why is that? Because the company that rents out those units gone bankrupt. Now, if you live in Briar Lane, a purpose-built management company, and that company goes bankrupt, your rent increase is the guideline. Either whether a bank is operating it or a new owner is operating it, so there's certainty there. You cannot use the secondary market to predict long-term rental construction. And the current way the system is constructed is it hasn't really dealt with the increased vacancy problem.
You want to come back on that?
Just one point is that the secondary market, which is the condo market, has essentially been the rental market since 1991. So the City of Toronto says
people basically buy units and then rent them out.
Yeah, so you have a lot of small investors of 1, 2, or 3 units. And so the City of Toronto says there's nearly 100,000. I think 60 or 70,000 of those are post-1991. That's a significant amount. And
they're not caught under controls, presumably.
They're not caught under controls. But if you didn't have them, the situation of supply would be so much worse, and that's our argument.
Can I ask Stephen about another phenomenon that we hear about from time to time, which is it's a bit of a loophole here. I'm not saying you're doing it. I haven't heard that you're doing anything wrong, but I've heard others are doing it, and I want to get your view on it. I own a rental unit. I make up a story about my uncle is moving back from the old country, and I need this unit for my uncle. So you kick the people out. There is no uncle. You leave it on the market vacant for a month or something like that, and then you double the rent and put somebody else in there, and that's kind of a loophole, a way to get around the rules.
Yes.
How much of that's going on out there?
Oh, I think it does happen. But if your tenant is sharp, they'll watch the market, and it is against the law. So you can be held accountable if you do that. But I'm sure it does happen. There's no question.
A lot or a little?
I don't know. I mean, it's a risk that I would never take, and I think it opens you up to a lot of hassle, legal and otherwise, and it's not ethical to begin with. But so I don't think it's happening maybe as much as people think.
Marva, what do you think?
I think it's happening a lot more than people think.
How do you know?
Because we have members of ACORNs. We represent like 32,000 Ontarians at ACORN, and when you have these issues that come up, when you have tenants calling you to tell you, oh, you know this, or I saw this, and now here I am, But the problem is, it's that a lot of tenants, they do not know their rights, and they don't understand the tenancy act. So they would just, when my landlord gave me the notice, okay, I have 60 days to move out. So they begin looking. They're not studying that. Oh, maybe he's going to re-rent the apartment.
One of the things, this will not come as a surprise to you. We've covered this story before. This story has been perpetual, almost for 4 decades. It's been around for a long time. And, I mean, it seems to me you both need each other, right? You need him to build buildings that you can live in. He needs you to rent these buildings, or he's got no source of income. And yet, the kind of sweet spot of compromise has always been so elusive for everybody to find. So let's do what you suggested a few moments ago, and let's look at some new ideas that could potentially find the sweet spot of compromise and make everybody happy. What have you got in mind?
So on this whole issue, which is around the 1991 exemption that's received a lot of media attention recently, we've communicated talking about some sort of a rolling exemption. Again, the NDP government had an exemption. We want to have certainty in the investor market so that when they make a decision that it's adhered to, because the worst thing is to have uncertainty, have the rules changing all the time.
So what's a rolling exemption?
It could be 10 years, it could be 15 years, it could be 20 years. That is something that would give confidence in terms of a new build in the market. We could talk about capping rates for that, whatever the percentage might be. As Steve indicated, right now in Ontario, it's an annual rate of 1.5%. The province sets that annually. So there may be something that you could look at for other markets or for new builds, because it's important, I think, for the government from a public policy point of view. We have this whole issue about housing. It's not just rental housing, but even on the ownership side, that they need supply and they need rental housing to meet a certain need. And so it's important that that be encouraged. And
but
so,
can I understand this? Jim, if they give you a rolling exemption of 10 or 20 years, and if they capped rates at what you thought was a reasonable level, your people would build apartments?
yes.
They would?
Yes.
Does that work for you?
No. I mean, right now they have a 1991 exemption. They have no cap. So, and they're not building to the need that Toronto needs in order to not have a 1.6% vacancy rate. And so,
what do you want to see then? Where's the sweet spot for you?
well, the sweet spot for me is rent control. How much that is to be set by the policymakers. I mean, maybe it could be set a little bit above the consumer price index.
But you want control on every building?
I do.
Old and new?
Exactly, yes. Because
How does that address his concern, though?
it doesn't fully. I'm not going to deny.
Doesn't sound like it does at all.
No, but our position is this. Housing is a social need. I understand that it's also a business, and landlords don't go into it because it's a social need, but it is a social need, and people who live in the city need to be able to work and live here and, not have to live 3 cities adjacent in order to come here.
Then let me pick up on that social need angle. Stephen, if it is in fact a social need and that there is a public policy good involved in rental accommodation, should the government be looking at flexible shelter allowances for tenants who, maybe can't keep up with the rent as well as they'd like to be?
Mm-hmm. I think there's still a stigma attached to that, and I think there's risk. I think that a landlord would look at. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is the second suites in houses. So, is there a role for government to play to subsidize that, or allow tax breaks, or some sort of incentives for people to look at their houses and maybe retrofit them? I read this morning.
Renting out the basement, that kind of thing?
Well, yeah. I read this morning about a term called overhousing. So a lot of our people. My father-in-law is 83 years old. He's his house. He lives alone, 3-bedroom house. He's with his partner on the weekend. His house is pretty much empty for much of the time. So
he's got too much housing.
He's got too much housing, and there's a lot of that out there where boomers sitting on too much house. So you wonder, is there an opportunity to increase the supply by allowing some incentive, government incentive, for people to retrofit their houses or promote that kind of thing?
Well, I guess part of the trouble of that is most municipalities, at least tell me, they're against basement units and these kinds of things because they worry about density and too much parking.
There's all
and
kinds of differences among the municipalities that aren't helping.
Right. Can I get back to that shelter allowance idea? Do you think some kind of government shelter allowance that would follow a tenant from building to building as opposed to just before that specific unit, would that get around some of your concerns?
Shelter allowance? An allowance is good, But why don't we just have the federal, the municipal, and the provincial government working together to provide the housing?
So get the government back in the housing
business.
business.
Yes, to fund the housing market. Because we look at housing ACORN look at housing as we have the federal government who's saying they're committed to this. Then we have the provincial government, and then we have the municipal government. And then in the end, it's just the municipal government who's fighting to get all of this done. So we need for the provincial government and the federal government to do their part.
What would the rental housing providers of Ontario think about that?
Well, our members want to provide the housing. Our members want to build the housing. We don't need the government to build all the housing. And further rent controls is going to put that at risk. And so we won't get any, which won't benefit, again, tenants at all because there'll be less choice and less options. In terms of providing income, one of the things of this whole debate that's interesting is it's much about income as it is about housing. And so people who have challenges with their rent or challenges with their mortgage or challenges with daycare are also the people that probably are, talking about other things that need to happen in terms of their income issues. And that's why we do support allowances and we do support portable housing benefits, because it is an issue just as much about income in certain situations. And so we've always supported that as an organization, in addition to the need for new supply.
Okay, we got literally a minute and a half to go here. Let me give sort of 20 seconds to each of you here on the following. This week, the Premier of Ontario did say that her government is developing, quote unquote, substantive rent control reform. Not sure what that's going to look like yet, but I do want to know what your advice to her would be in what she might bring forward.
Yeah, I'm supportive of rent controls. I think you have to have some flexibility to address the investment issue. So, so having it 1.5 is not going to be the answer. You have to have more flexibility to promote that investment, promote that supply, and I think you can get something reasonable there.
Martha.
I think I would tell her to, end the vacancy decontrol. I would say put an end to above the guideline rent increase and have it on every building in Ontario, because they've been having it for 26 years. You have the guideline, above the guideline rent increases that you've been using. The tenants pay for the landlord's work, and where is it getting the tenants?
Jim.
Have a conversation, have a discussion, have a consultation with the industry to provide real practical solutions that will result in the continuance of new construction, as opposed to going back to the same old, which will mean no new units.
Kelly.
I would say that look carefully at the issue of rent control and to create a policy that allows tenants to feel wherever they live in, whatever kind of unit they live in, that there is certainty and that there's predictability in their financial life.
Do we hope that she comes forward with something that all of you will dislike, which means she's probably found the sweet spot?
Who knows?
We shall see. Kelly, Marva, Jim, Stephen, thank you for coming into TVO tonight and demonstrating for us once again why this is such an intractable issue for so many years across the province of Ontario. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Bacon is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario on behalf of its more than 85,000 members and 23,000 students.